Posing for animation, a quick checklist. Like I said, this is the checklist that I use when I am posing or studying or critiquing other people's poses or even creating my own poses. So, the first thing here is, why is it important? Why is posing important to begin with? And this is actually something I get asked a lot when I am teaching classes. And the big reason is that posing is our foundation. Good posing is going to make or break a shot. It is the heart and core of any animation, and everything gets built up on that. If you don't have a good pose, nothing else will work. You can take good posing, and good posing will make almost any animation better. Even if your spacing, if your timing isn't quite right, a good solid pose, super appealing pose, is still gonna feel good. You can see it from these pictures here. These are pictures from Genevieve Sai. She is an awesome artist. And MLP Subido, thank you so much for the sub. I really appreciate that. 7 months, geez, thank you so much. But these drawings here are from Genevieve Sai. She's a artist who works for Warner Brothers. She actually redid the designs for the new Warner Brothers and Warner sister Dot for the new Animaniacs. She is an amazing artist. And in all of her drawings, you can see there's an appeal of a sense of motion, of interest in every single one of these. And that's the power of posing. Even without animation, we get it. We get the character. We get what we're supposed to be feeling. Without solid posing, no matter how good your animation is, it's never going to feel really interesting because you don't have that foundation. If a character is just boring to look at, no matter how they move, it's still going to be boring to look at. Now, with that said, it doesn't mean that your animation is going to be terrible. For example, I could take a sphere and animate that and just use a sphere and make an interesting animation. I could take a cube and animate that and get an interesting animation. It's still going to look interesting. But without the posing, especially when you're dealing with a character, it's just going to be that. It's going to be a shape moving across the screen versus a character, a dynamic entity moving through the scene, something that we want to see complete their journey. So, with that, what makes a good pose? We could dive into this forever. This is a topic that we could spend hours and hours and hours and hours on, but I'm going to try to condense it into a few principles that I look for. Now, these are not all principles. Every artist is different. These are not like written in stone. You have to hit these all the time. These are things I look for. So, the list that I typically go for, and Lucas, thank you so much for the sub. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Will it be available on Discord? Yes, I'll post this as soon. I've got some refining to do, but I'll post this for everyone to have on hand. So, the list of things I look for is this. I look for line of action, silhouette value, straights versus curves, weight and balance, asymmetry, simplified shapes, contrapposto and twist, avoiding tangents, visual anchors, exaggeration, gesture, and character. Lots of different things. But this is my checklist. This is what I go through whenever I am creating a pose. Now, like I said, do these all have to be met? No. This is just a checklist. It's similar to the 12 principles of animation in that as much as you can add all the 12 principles, sometimes we can omit one or tweak one, use one more than the other to create visual styles and to create a different feeling to our animation, or in this case, our posing. But in general, most good poses will have all of these. Now, this, just to be clear, this is for posing, not for character design, not for visual design, that kind of element. This is specifically for character posing. So, let's actually go through what each of these are, especially for anyone who's new to animation or new to to posing in general, a lot of these terms might seem a little vague. So let's go through a few of them. So first up, line of action. Line of action, also known as the line of force, is pretty much the foundation for any good pose. It determines the action, it makes sure that things are easy to read, and it leads the audience's eye across the screen. It shows the force of the action, as we can see in the top right corner here. You can really feel the force coming through and from Tom into the other cat there. We feel that our eye going through that pose, especially compared to that other one where you don't know where to look. Our eyes should be going to the punch, but they're not really going anywhere. Not only that, but once you start animating the line of action, so you've got your individual pose, but once you start adding more and animating between them, the changes and reversals in that line of action will make your animation more dynamic. It'll make it feel bigger, stronger. Everything will be more interesting. Now, in general, we typically use 4 types of lines of action, although you could almost argue that it's 3. We have straights, which you can see here. I would consider this a straight. It's still slightly curved, but it's more of a straight line. Those are the strongest types of lines of action. They indicate a lot of force being put into one direction. You have C's, or reverse C's. This is where some people just call them C's, others there's C's and reverse C's, which is just the other way. So for example, this one right here, that would be a C right in there. In the bottom right here, oh, can't see that, my camera's in the way. Well, we'll go over here, bottom left. Those are C's right there. So those are not as strong as a straight line of action, but still fairly strong. The weakest line is an S-curve. Now, an S-curve, just because it's weak, doesn't mean it's bad. So for example, right here in the middle, this is an S-curve. And an S-curve is going to be the kind of the most fluid of all of the lines. It is going to be the weakest, but kind of the most dynamic in certain ways. It makes the character feel relaxed. Or yeah, as Proko says, C, S, and I. So that's another way to look at it. So those are the main types of lines of action. Now, technically we can make all sorts of lines of actions. We can make Zs and zigzags and whatnot. But the more we add complexity to the line of action, the less interesting and easy to see it'll be. The simpler the line, the easier it is for the audience to register what's happening. And in animation, it makes it so that things don't get visually complex in a way that loses the audience. So we tend to want to keep it simple. Now, once you have your line of action, another thing that becomes very important is how we use the other elements to enhance the line of action. So this goes into dynamic posing. It's still line of action, but as we're posing things out, we want to make sure that the lines that go along with the line of action. So for example, in the top right corner here, you have the main line of action going from one hand all the way to the other. See how all the other lines are working with that? They're either flowing along with or connecting back to the main line of action. This is very important. This will create a visual kind of structure to your posing and avoid what's typically called starfishing, which is a pose where everything is just pointing out in random directions, like Patrick Star. Now, to be fair, Patrick Star is actually very well posed in a lot of episodes of SpongeBob. In this case here, he is starfishing. Everything out in different directions, no unified line of action at all. Is that bad? No, not necessarily. But it's not as interesting, it's not as dynamic as something where everything flows along with. So you can see here in the middle here, this pose is interesting, but all of the lines are just pointing in different directions. It doesn't have that dynamic feel to it. So line of action is our foundation. Once we have our line, we can build the entire pose off of that And I've even done animation tests where I've just animated the line of action, just a quick line, and animated that to create the feeling of an entire shot before I even animate the character. This way I know whether the shot's going to be dynamic or not, even without doing the rest. And it's a good way to just do a quick little test. Okay, so that's the first item on our checklist, line of action, very important. The next one is going to be silhouette value. Now the silhouette is an image of a person, animal, object, or scene represented as a solid shape of a single color. So basically the outline of a character. And in animation, a clear silhouette is going to be what allows the audience to easily understand what the character is doing, who they are, what their pose is. It allows you to easily see which character is which. So a good silhouette in terms of character design allows us to look at this list of characters up here and differentiate each one. Even though we don't see any visual detail in terms of colors or anything like that, we know exactly who all of these characters are. And Tiki, thank you so much for the subscription. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And I also got your message. I'm gonna check that, check out the program so quick. I'm so excited for it. So we get to see all of these. Now, the other thing with silhouette that a lot of people don't think about right away, especially when they're first learning about all of these concepts, is negative space. Negative space is the empty area around the character or within the silhouette. These are very important because they can make a pose more interesting. And if you animate the negative space, if you pay attention to how the negative space changes as a character pose changes, you can make things much more visually interesting. So for example, negative space would be the gap in Betty Boop's arms here, even Tasmanian Devil here. The negative space is all around the character, but also the gap between his arm and his thumb right there. That negative space is very, very important. We have to watch out for that. Okay, now with silhouette, there is a very common misconception that almost all animators, when they first start out, will fall into, especially if they don't have posing experience beforehand, which is that to get a good silhouette, you need to have everything sticking out to be visible. So the hands have to be visible, the head has to be visible, the legs have to be visible. Everything has to be visible in silhouette. That is not true. A good example of this is here. These are three very distinct silhouettes, and I'm guessing most of you will be able to guess who's who here. You don't see their arms, you don't see much visual detail in most of it, but it still works. So, this is the most common mistake I see with silhouette. Having to put things out. No, it is not the case. We can keep things internal within a silhouette. It will still work. Now, the key here is that when we are keeping elements in the silhouette, we want to make sure that the silhouette is still readable. So, for example, here, let's take Batman, for example. He's got the little ears there. If he was to tilt his head down so that the ears themselves no longer become a part of that silhouette, that would just round out the head and the pose wouldn't read anymore. We need to keep certain elements visible so that we know which character we're looking at. It doesn't always have to be the case, but ideally we should have something that indicates to the audience what they're looking at. If it's, for example, just a circle and nothing else, that's going to be a little hard to read. Now, with that said, how do we make sure that the rest of the silhouette reads well? Well, this is where the second part of the silhouette value comes in. Value, the color saturation or intensity of the different elements. So for example, in this scene here, even though the face, the hands, and the ukulele are all kind of within the silhouette of the character, they're not visible, he's not playing the ukulele out here, they're all within his silhouette. it is still super clear and easy to see because the values, the colors, and the saturation, all of that stands out against him, against his black shirts, against the different colors. So even though he's within his own silhouette, it's reading clearly. Now, an example of that would be, let's say I've got my pen here, and it's got this black section right there. If I keep this out here, that's still going to be pretty clear in silhouette. If I bring it down here, suddenly that's not so clear anymore, is it? It's hard to see against the black shirt. But if I bring this against the orange, suddenly it's easy to see. If I put it up against my skin, that's easy to see. If I go against my hair, it disappears. So if you're going to have something internal, that's not a problem, as long as you think of the value now and the silhouette value. That's going to allow you to make more dynamic poses, have characters that can cross within their own silhouette, but it still reads clearly to the audience. Now, a lot of this will come down to character design. So as animators, we are kind of limited to what the character design is going to be. So for example, if you have a character, let's say I've got some images here. Okay. So these are the Smurfs. So these characters, you can see all of them have a very similar silhouette. So it's going to be hard to tell which is which. That's not a problem. That's just the character design of these characters. But their hands are the same color as their face and their body, which means that if they were to cover their hand just like this, put their hand over their chest without breaking out of silhouette, it would not read clearly. In their case, if you're going to cross the arms over the body, you need to keep something out. So for example, this one here where he's plugging his ears, those hands have to be visible. Now, let's find another example here. Let's go with this Family Guy. His arm is all the way within his silhouette, but it still reads clearly because we have that value. His skin versus his shirt versus his pants all read clearly. So they don't have to worry about that arm being out in silhouette. As long as we keep those two things in mind, our silhouettes will read clearly. So, silhouette value, very, very important. If we start losing our silhouette, things just won't read correctly. It's going to take more for the audience to register what's going on. Okay, what's next? Straight versus curves. This is one of the ones that I talk about the most when I am showcasing things and kind of giving critiques to people. And this is kind of a more advanced topic in terms of posing, but it really does help to accentuate poses and make them read more clearly. So, straights versus curves. These are also known as simple versus complex, also squash and stretch. Not the same as the animation principle squash and stretch, but simply one side is stretched while the other side is squashed, bent. So applying straights and curves to a pose will help to create a visual flow that typically makes it more appealing and, more importantly, leads the audience's eye across the pose. You can actually see this in this second example here of the arm, how there's just these round shapes that make up the arm. It makes it very hard for our eye to travel across the image. Our eyes kind of want to look at something and then they just stick there. Now, by using the straights versus curves, for example, on this other arm here, our eyes automatically want to follow the lines. It's almost like looking down a river that's flowing down. So our eyes kind of follow one curve and then flow on to the next one and down, all the way down to the bottom. This applies throughout the body. The human body is also made out of straights and curves. If you actually start studying anatomy, you'll start noticing that quite a bit. How our body has these contrasting forms, straights versus curves. So by applying this, you create a better visual flow and just kind of more appeal to a pose. Once again, is this necessary? No. Keep in mind, this is really down to the visual style. If you've seen Adventure Time, you'll notice that their arms tend to be just curves or straights. Very simple. That doesn't make it a bad design, but in general, posing will be stronger if we apply this. So let's actually take a look at some examples here. So here are some examples of straights versus curves. So for example, in Moana, they're applying this not just to the individual body parts, but through the entire pose. If we break down the pose and simplify it, on the left side here, you get a very simple straight. It's a very simple outline if you just look at that silhouette. On the other side, look at how much more complex it is. We get a bend right in here at the arm, comes down into the waist. We get a bend here. It comes out into this leg, comes back in. There's the ankle, goes out, back in, another line. There we go. So we've got simple versus complex. Again, straight versus curves. It's the same thing, just different names. If we look at all of these poses, it's the same thing. There is a simple line on one side and a more complex line on the other. It allows for the eye to travel across the pose more efficiently and just kind of makes it more visually dynamic. Again, do you need this? No, but it is really good to have and to try and incorporate some sort of element in this. It just breaks up the pose and makes it more interesting. Okay, next up, weight and balance. This is a big one, which is often misunderstood. Weight and balance does not mean that the character has to feel heavy and has to be in balance. Not at all. It's thinking of when is the character in balance and should they be in balance, and should the character feel heavy or light. So another term for this is center of gravity. Where is their balance point as they are balancing or doing anything? And this can be very different depending on what your characters are doing. So for example, a character who's just standing still, you would want their balance point, if they're not doing anything, to be over their feet. So they are balanced over top of their feet. If they're standing and they're way off to the side, that's not going to feel like they're balanced. So for example, let's say if this character here right in the middle was not holding onto something heavy and was just standing there, just kind of casually standing, there's no way they could stay balanced right here. Their foot is way too far screen left for them to be in balance. They would fall over. Now, what's happening is that they're actually moving. They are swinging this heavy weight around and they're about to throw it, which means that if they are moving, their center of gravity is going to be offset. This comes into studying animation, studying the body mechanics, things like that. But we want to pay attention to that. Should our character be in balance or out of balance? If they're lifting something heavy, how will that affect their center of gravity? When you lift something heavy, your center of gravity adjusts based on that heavy object. So for example, if I lifted something heavy here, my whole body would lean back so that the heavy object starts to go over my balance point, in which case would probably be at my feet. So that will affect your pose. You need to think about this and pay attention to that balance point, the weight and balance. Really, there's not too much more than that, but oftentimes this is going to be a big thing that will break a pose and make it feel fake if a character doesn't feel properly balanced compared to the weight. Okay, next one, asymmetry, also known as twinning. When characters do the same thing on both sides, it makes things feel flat and uninteresting. By offsetting things, we make it more interesting. So, as we can see by Mickey Mouse here, on the left side, everything is perfectly even. The arms are doing the exact same thing. It is not interesting. Even the shirt is twinning. On the right side, there's depth. There's visual interest. One hand is doing something different than the other. It's just more fun to look at. Now, do we have to go this far? No. Twinning is very simple to break up by just adding a little offset. So for example, if I'm going to have a character do something like this, instead of having the hands kind of both be even like that, I can just do that. A little offset, and I've broken up the twinning. I could add a little bit more rotation to one hand versus another, and now I get a little bit more of a different silhouette. So I get something like that. You can break up twinning in a lot of different ways that it's just more visually dynamic. So twinning is not necessarily, or asymmetry. Asymmetry is not a must. Sometimes you can have symmetrical poses, but you have to be very careful how you do them so that they don't flatten out. As soon as symmetry starts to come in or twinning comes in, it's going to feel flatter than a pose that's a little bit more asymmetrical. And his face is breaking the twinning, so his ears are on one side, his nose is on the other. It's not like the ears are both symmetrical, but even then, it's still twinning. As long as two elements are kind of doing the same thing, so even if his legs were different, his body was different, if his hands are doing the same thing, that's still twinning or symmetry. So we want to avoid that as much as we can. Again, typically. A lot of these kind of checklist items, they are not, again, rules that have to be followed and adhered to at all times. Sometimes we do want to have something twin for a very specific reason. Sometimes we do want a character to feel out of balance. Sometimes we do want a silhouette to be a little bit muddier or not as clear. But we're doing it for a reason. That's the key point here. And this goes for every point that I'm going to be talking about from this, well, on this whole list, is whenever we're animating, whether we're posing out or actually animating, we are thinking to ourselves, why am I doing this? Or why shouldn't I be doing this? Why is doing the thing I'm doing right now, adding twinning, let's say, how is this going to make my shot better versus not having it? Normally, not having it's going to be better, but maybe it's just going to make for a more powerful image. So for example, you want someone to, let's say, a very common image is a person who's being, like, let's say a gift from the gods, like Zeus is bestowing a gift upon the mere mortals below, and you have the people raising their hands and praise. That would be twinning, both hands up in the air, but it's doing a very symbolic pose. That makes it stronger because of the symbolism. If I'm just twinning for twinning's sake and no other reason, my pose is just weak. So we want to think about it. So, a long talk on asymmetry, but a very important one. So, with that, let's go into simplified shapes. Now, simplified shapes is basically trying to think of your entire pose as a simpler form. And what this basically allows you to do is make things more, visually interesting, avoid becoming overly complex with your posing, but more importantly, avoiding boring shapes. So boring shapes are typically things like perfect squares or rectangles, because all the lines tend to be parallel to each other. That makes things not as interesting. Instead, if we think of things as triangles or circles, or like the bottom examples here, these parallelograms, these offset squares and shapes, we can make a pose feel more dynamic very quickly. It doesn't mean that we have to shape the character as if they're stuck in a box, but we kind of simplify the overall form. This is especially useful when you're dealing with legs, I find. If you're kind of posing out legs and moving them in just random poses, It can be very weird, or you can very easily fall into moments where the legs are just parallel and boring. So, simplified shapes. Not much else to say, really. Just simplify your form to some basic forms. Now, one of my favorites, contrapposto and twist. So, let's start off with contrapposto. Contrapposto is basically the shoulders and hips being at opposing angles from each other. That's pretty much it. This makes your posing so much more visually interesting. If the shoulders and hips are the same, parallel to each other, it creates a feeling of flatness to a pose, and it takes away a lot of the weight of the character. And not weight as in heaviness, but weight as in physicality, that they actually have weight to them and they're not just a piece of paper fluttering across the screen. By adding contrapposto, you get this feeling of life to a character. And this is a very important step in terms of art. If you've studied art history, if you look at Egyptian hieroglyphs, everything is very stiff and straight. Everything is kind of flat because there's no contrapposto. The shoulders and hips are always the same. When you look at Greek history and Greek sculptures, for example, any Greek sculpture or Michelangelo's sculptures, things like that, you'll notice that they angle the hips and shoulders and create contrapposto, and they feel so alive, so dynamic, so interesting. We can do this in our shots. It makes a huge difference. It also adds asymmetry automatically, which is really good. Now, there is a common misconception to contrapposto, and I'm gonna actually draw this out for everyone here. So the common misconception is that when we're doing contrapposto, it is a line that goes up and a line that goes down, for example. So this would create our contrapposto. We'd have our character like that, and then the hips would come down here. Okay, so we have a line that goes up, one that goes down. Doesn't have to be that way. Contrapposto just means that the lines are opposing, not parallel. So if we continue that line, you'll see they'll meet up there. And I can prove this just by rotating my image. Boop. Look at that. Both lines now go up. It's still contrapposto. It's just at an angle. So when you're doing contrapposto, normally we have kind of one line going up, one line going down. But it really depends on the angle of your character and your camera. As long as you're thinking of that contrast between the character, you're going to get contrapposto. So, contrapposto, very, very important. After that, we have twist. Twist is basically similar in the sense that it's the opposing force of the hip and the chest, but twist goes throughout the whole body. It's the hip countering the rotation of the chest, which could also counter the rotation of the head. And by adding twist, you can especially see it here in that top image here, how it just makes the character more dynamic. It adds so much more force to a character. Twist is important, and I see a lot of students miss this element. Without twist, no matter how much you push a pose, it'll always feel kind of flat. By adding in that twist, you get this feeling of opposition. Basically, muscles on one side of the body feeling like they're contracting and the other one's stretching. It's adding a form of squash and stretch. It's kind of another way of looking at it would be the force of the character compressing one side. It makes it interesting. Do we have to add it all the time? No, because if you kind of look at your own body and feel how you move, you're not constantly twisting and turning and doing all of these complex, like, extra things with your body. But when, let's say I'm sitting in my chair and I turn my body, I'm twisting. My hips are staying still and I'm twisting my body. It makes it very dynamic. So, contrapposto and twist. the whole point of this is just makes things dynamic. That's what it does. Next up, avoiding tangents. Tangents is one of the big things that as you're animating, you will start to notice. Once you notice them and get used to seeing them, they are everywhere and they are a pain to avoid completely. You'll never avoid all of them. And there's all sorts of different tangents. Tangents are basically when two or more lines interact in a way that creates a new relationship between them that you as the artist did not intend. And what it can do is it can remove the depth, it can create odd focus points, and it just kind of flattens the image. So, the most common type of tangent that we'll see is the bump up tangent. As animators, this is usually the one we'll run into the most, especially CG animators. And this is probably one of the biggest ones that tend to flatten an image. The others add visual complexity or weird focus points, but this will actually flatten an image. And the reason for this is, let's actually go full screen here. If I take my hands and put them side by side like this, we can see that, oh, they're the same size. I guess they must be next to each other. Okay, pretty simple. If I do this, we can see, one hand is closer, one hand is further away because of the size. The size on screen determines our depth of the image. If I overlap them, let's do this, the camera's backwards, so it takes a while. If I overlap them like this, we get even more depth because now we can see that one hand is in front of the other. More depth. But if I do this and I line up my hands so they bump up right next to each other like that, so I create the tangents, suddenly it feels like I've got one big hand here and one tiny little hand over there that are side by side. The tangent makes us think visually that the objects are next to each other. So when we look at the bump up tangent, it can create the feeling that characters are literally bumping up against an object instead of the depth. Now the other types of tangents, and there's more types of tangents than this. I've actually got a link for everyone at the end of this that's going to show you all the different types. But we need to watch out for tangents. Be very aware of where they can happen and try to avoid them as much as you can. It's not going to be possible to avoid every single tangent all the time. They're just going to happen, especially when you have a visually complex background. For example, what I have back here, no matter where I'm going to put my hand, it's going to tangent something in the back. But as long as I'm not tangenting with the main elements or a main element back there, it'll be fine. So, avoiding tangents, very important and very frustrating at times. Visual anchors. Visual anchors is something that we as CG animators don't have to worry too much about because because we're using a CG rig, a 3D rig, we automatically get most of this, but it is still very important. So these are also known as construction lines if you're drawing. Basically, it's lines that indicate the form of an object. So for example, things like a hat, things like a collar, things like boots in this case, it shows us the direction that an object is rotated. So for example, if I have my shirt sleeve here, you can see that even without seeing the rest of my arm, you can tell the angle of my arm based on the curvature of that shirt sleeve. But if I was to pose my arm in a way where that becomes flat and just a straight line, suddenly it removes the depth of an image. It feels flatter. If you're posing your character and they have a very distinct object on them, for example, shirt sleeves, a collar, a necklace, a hat, it can be very helpful to use those as a visual anchor, a way to visualize the depth and the 3D aspect of the pose. Again, as CG animators, this is not going to be not a big thing on our list. It's probably going to be right at the bottom because it'll just kind of happen naturally. But it is something I still look for. And specifically, I look for kind of the opposite, where my visual anchor, let's say a hat or collar, is starting to flatten out the image by being too flat. If my collar, for example, here is just starting to create a perfectly flat line right there, suddenly that kind of looks weird, doesn't it? It looks like my shirt's backwards, or it seems a little odd compared to this, where we get that shape of the shirt as well as the body underneath. So visual anchors, it's more of just a double check for us as CG animators. If you're doing 2D animation, you want to really pay attention to this. Now, next up, exaggeration. Technically, it's already an animation principle. So when we're posing for animation, it should be part of our checklist. But even then, it's always good to exaggerate. Exaggeration is worth mentioning twice because most people don't exaggerate nearly enough, me included. Exaggeration is really just pushing your poses to be more dynamic, clearer, more interesting. If you do a first pass on your pose, do a second pass where you try to make it better, make it bigger, make it stronger. If you take it from your reference, exaggerate your reference. Don't just copy your reference. Make it bigger, stronger, more dynamic. Now, a common misconception with exaggeration is that when we exaggerate, we always have to make things bigger. So if I've got a line of action, I have to make it more of a curve. If I have a character who is trying to lift something, make it heavier. No. Sometimes exaggeration means bringing things down. So, for example, let's say I have a character who's supposed to be scared and like really kind of scared stiff. Well, I wouldn't want to make the curve bigger. I would want to make it less. Straighten the curve. It's taking the core of the pose, the feeling of the pose, and making it more. If a character is supposed to be boring and flat, take the character and exaggerate their poses to be flatter. Not bigger, not more bendy or stronger, flatter, weaker. It goes both ways. Exaggeration just means making something more. So always, whenever you're creating a pose, make sure you add in an exaggeration step to it. Where you might have posed it out already, see if you can exaggerate it, make it stronger. Now, the last thing on our list here is gesture and character. And this is probably my favorite one on the list. It's also probably the most important element on this list. Not so much important in the sense that it's going to make your poses better. Honestly, it doesn't make your poses better. But it's crucial because gesture and character are what make the pose unique. Not just a random pose, not just a happy pose, not just a sad pose, but a pose that is for this character. When we're animating and when we're posing something, we're not just posing a rig. We're not just posing a set of controls. What we should be doing is posing a character, a specific person or creature that we want to create. So the gesture is going to be the goal of the pose. What is the character's goal? What is the goal that you want to show to the audience? Are you making a strong statement to that? Is the pose clear? Does it read? It's the personality, exactly. So that the gesture is more of the goal. The character is the personality. Who is this character? What is their personality? What is their subtext? What are they feeling right now? And do those translate into the pose? So for example, if we look here, these are all pictures of Rapunzel from Tangled. Part of her character is her hair. Her character is very tied into her long hair and how she uses it every day. She climbs with it, she makes a hammock out of it, she does all sorts of things with it. And in her posing, they use that to make the poses unique to her. You wouldn't see Flynn Rider in the same show holding his hair down and using it kind of as a shield if she's scared. as she's thinking, kind of holding her hair up to her mouth and kind of tapping it there or pulling it out sideways. That's unique to her. Every character has these unique traits to them that you can use to enhance the posing and make sure that it's just not generic. And as an animator, especially when you're working on your own demo reel, one of the big suggestions I always give to people is think of who your character is. When you're putting a demo reel together, the last thing you want is for a shot to just feel like rig, 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 and they're all moving. It should feel like a character. Even if you used the same rig 5 times, or the same character 5 times, I should say if you use the same character design, if you're doing a 2D reel. Whether you're using the same character design or the same rig, each demo reel piece should feel like a different person. It should feel like a unique individual compared to the other one. That's going to be very important. So as you're posing out, are you making sure that this character is unique? That what they are doing is the way they would do it versus the way someone else would do it? And if it's starting to look a little generic, how can you make it feel more unique to this character? Or especially to what they are doing right now or feeling right now. So that's the checklist. That's pretty much it. So with all of that, how do we make ourselves better? How can you improve your posing? Well, it really comes down to studying. So what I typically recommend to all of my students is master studies. Look up drawings, look up poses, look up stills from animations framed through a cartoon, and figure out what makes those poses so appealing. Study them. Study the masters. Next, do some gesture drawing. Learn how to do gesture drawing. Gesture drawing is not anatomy drawing. It's not taking in all the details. It's learning to quickly capture a pose and a feeling and the feeling of motion in just a quick doodle. And this is not learn how to do gesture drawing so that you're a master artist. Not at all. Learn how to do gesture drawing so that you can build a library of poses in your mind. Learn what makes a good pose versus a bad pose. It'll strengthen your ability to create poses a lot and make you faster at posing. Learn anatomy. Now, this is not to say that you have to learn every muscle in the human body and every bone and all of that stuff. No. But learning how the body moves, how far it can flex in different ways. Learning the core, at least the core artistic muscles. All of these kind of help you improve your posing by learning how everything's connected. And for example, if I move my arm up here, it's not just the shoulder that's rotating, it's my whole clavicle that's rotating from the pivot point right here. That whole bone right there is moving up. As that moves up, it's stretching my entire pectoral muscle right here, all the way down to the sternum, the middle of the chest. That whole area is being affected. Again, do you need to know all the details and all those names? No. But at least knowing how everything's connected basically will allow you to make sure that your poses actually feel connected. Pose tests. Instead of always working on big animations, just take some time and do a simple pose test. Take a character rig, pose them out. Maybe try to copy a pose or recreate a pose from another cartoon. So for example, let's say I'm looking at Tangled and I really love the way they pose out the characters. Okay, I'm going to take a different character rig and see if I can recreate that same feeling in that pose and use a different character for it. I'm not going to put it on my reel or anything, but I'm doing pose tests. I'm trying to understand what they did to make that pose read so well and make it interesting. That builds your experience so that when you actually do get into a shot and start working on a shot, you already know how to pose out a character and get good, interesting, dynamic poses to them. Seek inspiration. This is one of my favorite parts, is just look for stuff that inspires you. So for me, I love to look at artists that just have a really strong poses. For example, I mentioned at the beginning Genevieve Tsai, who is a artist at Warner Brothers right now and working on the new Animaniacs. She is doing amazing work. Her every time I see work from her, it's just like bursts of inspiration. Find artists that you love. Find shows that you love. The Tangled TV series is another one that I've been watching. I watched a while back, but I keep going back to it every once in a while because the posing is so strong in there. Different films as well. Look at those and really just absorb that inspiration and then study it as well. It's master studies as well. Haha, it's 2 in 1. And then the last is practice. Just keep practicing. The more you practice, the better you'll get. This does not come in overnight. You're not just going to one day wake up and poof, haha, you can pose. It takes practice and practice and practice and practice. The more you do it, the better you'll be. So with that, here are some links that I would recommend checking out. I'm going to post these in the chat here in just a second. But basically, these are just a bunch of resources that go a little bit more in depth on some of these topics. So how to get solid drawing, which honestly, solid drawing is a principle of animation. It is one of the 12 principles. And as CG animators, oftentimes people will go, well, we don't need that anymore. We don't need to draw, so we don't need solid drawing. Solid drawing really goes into posing. That's what it is. It's making a good pose, a pose that feels solid, that feels real. So learning how to do solid drawing or posing is very important. So we've got one on solid drawing here, line of action, the more solid drawing tips, how to draw SpongeBob, which is a really cool site that just has a lot of cool drawing tips. This is one of my favorites. Guide to spotting tangents, and some figure drawing, gesture drawing, and some tips right here. So Grizz and Norm. For anyone who hasn't seen Grizz and Norm, they are an amazing resource. They actually have a book. I believe it's 100 Tuesday Tips. I highly recommend getting. It's just filled with a lot of awesome information, and you probably, for anyone who's seen Grizz and Norm stuff, you've seen that I use a lot of their images in this presentation here because it's just that good. Their stuff is top notch. So I would recommend checking these out. As I said, I'm going to be posting these in the chat in just a little bit here. But let me actually go through here and go over some questions. So actually, I should put a closing statement. So that's pretty much it. Let me actually go to the list again, so you guys can see the entire checklist. There we go. So this is my posing checklist. This is what I go through whenever I look at a pose, whenever I'm posing a pose, when I need to figure out how to make it better. Now there is more to this. This is the basics right here. As we start going into multiple characters, into more complex designs, when we start going into composition and storytelling, a lot of things will get added to this. But this would be the main core checklist for any pose.